is really looking at how do you develop social networks from texts that are sort of disembodied from individuals. It's not between two authors or between two publishers or a publisher and an author, it's just the texts themselves, and creating social networks from that. Particularly from networks that are horribly ridden with holes and other problems. So what I'm going to talk about today briefly is scissors and paste journalism, which is a form of newspaper production from the late 18th, early 19th century, arguably continuing to the present day, but mostly the 19th century. How you identify reprints and memes with the computer, how you understand dissemination pathways, which will all make sense in a moment, how you do that manually, how you do that with computers, and what I hope to do in the future. So what is scissors and paste journalism for those of you who don't know? Well, in the 18th and 19th century, in what became the United States, British North America, and Great Britain, there are no copyright laws for periodical material, especially for newspaper. It's explicitly removed from copyright legislation in the United States. If it's in a newspaper, it's public domain instantly. You can reprint it with or without attribution. There's no Creative Commons licensing going on. And this is really important to understanding journalism in Georgian Britain because by about 1780, you start moving out of having London and Oxford newspapers, and you get lots of provincial newspapers. Now, there are already some in Edinburgh in Scotland, but really start getting papers in Liverpool and Sheffield and Bristol and Glasgow and Dundee and Kelso and the Scottish borders. And part of that is because you have lots of journeyman printers. People working underneath editors, they get a little too big for their britches, they want their own newspaper, they go or hired by a small town to open a newspaper there, and it becomes a lot cheaper because the stamp duty, the tax on newspapers, becomes much cheaper, so it becomes a much more economically viable business. So after 1750, especially after 1780 in Scotland, you get a huge number of newspapers, and not very many journalists. You don't get roving reporters, you certainly don't get foreign correspondents. So what they start doing essentially is if one person gets a letter, gets a bit of news from abroad, every other newspaper will get a subscription and copy it and put it in their newspaper. So a London daily newspaper might have 5 or 6 stories about Australia or Kentucky, and a Scottish newspaper will get a subscription to that London paper, very low tech, cut out literally with scissors the bits it likes, retypeset it, put it in its newspaper 2 or 3 days later. And there's a lot of brand loyalty, so if you live in Glasgow, you'll get the Glasgow Advertiser. You won't get the Morning Post or the Morning Chronicle from London, unless you're a businessman and you need that detailed trade news. So you have to find all this material for your newspaper. You're sometimes just a single guy with a printing press, as is the case of the Glasgow Advertiser. It's actually a hand-me-down press, it's really kind of sad. And you have to fill up your 2 issues a week with something, because you've got to attract readers and advertisers. You don't have any journalists, but newspapers have a special feature in both Britain and America, which is you can send them through the mail for free. There's no postage on newspapers. So they can get these subscriptions very, very easily, trade with each other as sort of a courtesy, or get an actual subscription. And they sort of cheat with this a lot. Sometimes you'll see editors write in the margins of newspapers letters to each other and then send the newspaper on, but it's not a letter. I don't have to pay for a stamp. It's just a bit of ephemera. So there's actually an advert I found on one that somebody had lost their newspaper, and it says that I've lost my newspaper. There's some indecipherable scribbles on the margin, and there was a 50 guinea or a 60-pound reward for the return of this newspaper. So I think there might have been something, industrial secrets or something being written on these newspapers. So why is it important to map out how these reprints happen? Well, it all kind of stems from a mistake I found in an article, which I've probably told this story too many times to anyone who knows me. But I was very, very intensely researching newspapers from the Scottish borders. And I read an article about Glasgow, and somebody mentioned a quotation. Glasgow feels this way about immigration, and here's my wonderful quotation to prove this. and I recognized the quotation. It wasn't by a Glaswegian. It wasn't from Glasgow. It was actually a Dumfries farmer writing to a Dumfries newspaper about Lockerbie. Had nothing to do with Glasgow. But that researcher couldn't have possibly known that because the Glasgow Herald hadn't attributed where it got it from. So they made a mistake just because they didn't understand this, or they didn't know the specific path this reprint had taken. So I've noticed lots of these mistakes in the past couple of years, and I wanted to create something to help researchers not make these errors or to see interesting points. I also noticed that if you looked through the entirety of Australian newspaper content, everything about Australia in Glasgow before 1820, every single newspaper article is written by the Sydney Gazette, whether or not it says it is, and it is curated by either the Morning Chronicle or the Morning Post in London. Everything goes to them first. And then all the Morning Chronicle articles are reprinted in Whig newspapers in Scotland, and all the Morning Post ones are printed in Tory newspapers in Scotland. So if the Chronicle or the Post in London didn't think it was interesting, Scotland didn't get to hear about it. And that's where those bottlenecks become really important. So how do you start putting together these networks? Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to find reprints or memes. Where do these come from? Well, there's a lot of promise behind these. You have these huge, large-scale digitization efforts to create OCR newspapers. So you can just scan for them, find all of these memes without having to read every newspaper from the 19th century. You can use keyword searching if you're just following one reprint in these massive databases, or use n-gram matching and plagiarism software like wcopyfind, which is surprisingly useful for a small corpus. Or you can use edition tracking software like Juxta to see how things change. But there's a lot of perils. Almost all the newspapers are going to be talking to other newspapers that are in a different digital collection. If I download the entirety of the 19th century British Library newspaper collection, I'm going to miss a lot of nodes because the Scotsman has its own archive, and the Times has its own archive, and newspaper.com has its own archive. So you have to kind of accept that. There's also the offline penumbra, all the things that are not and will never be digitized. So how do you deal with those, all those missing nodes? And even if you had every newspaper, the OCR is just really bad. So how are you going to choose what counts as a meme, which is just a turn of phrase, things like that? Now, fortunately for me, a lot, but not all of these problems are being worked on by the Viral Text Project at Northeastern University, which is looking at the Library of Congress 19th century newspapers in the US. And they're repairing the OCR and really mapping out all of these interesting memes. And it's a really interesting project, and I suggest you go and look at it. But my problem with the meme project is they're identifying something that gets repeated a lot. They're not really as interested in who is repeating whose version, how it's evolving over time. And I've spoken to Ryan Cordell and various other people, and it's too hard to do. You can put it chronologically, but that doesn't account for branching off evolutions. So how do you sort of do this? Well, doing memes, this was my incredibly short Python program. That's the entire program. And basically cuts up my entire corpus into n-grams and puts a list of all those n-grams, 3-word, 5-word, 7 words together, and you end up with this scary spreadsheet. The top ones aren't that useful because it's things like New South Wales. Well, the term New South Wales gets used a lot. But when you get to certain unusual phrases about missionaries doing naughty things, you start to see that Article 4, 5, 6, and 7 all share a lot of n-grams. So they're probably the same story, at least very similar. So now that you have those memes, how do you put them into some sort of a visualization? Well, Viral Text, as I said, does a really intensely beautiful and interactive visualization of the memes. The larger the node, the more often that particular newspaper reprinted things or had the most number of popular memes in it. You can also track it geographically. This is one particular story, and the single image doesn't do it justice. If you go to this YouTube ad, YouTube video, it has over time, but you can see the story creeping across the western states of the United States. And it's interesting to see how the story spreads. But again, it's chronological. There are memes that are similar, but it's not giving me that who exactly is stealing from who idea. So I try to think about it in the genealogical model. You have all these different influences, sometimes, maybe it's just a single article, going into a point, and then that person changes it somehow. They add a little bit, take away a little bit, misspell things very badly, and then it branches off into whole new trees. So how do I explain that to a computer? How do I make it do that for my OCR text without me having to explain it? Well, the easiest way to do that is to do it manually, write down what I did, and see if you can translate that into computer code. So I have this article, which appeared in the Glasgow Advertiser, later the Herald, in October of 1793, page 5 nestled in an inside page, and it is about the deaths of various white settlers at the hands of the very vilely portrayed Cherokee and or Creek, depending on which version of the story you get. But these comes ostensibly according to the dateline from Knoxville, Tennessee, on May the 11th. And there's another story from Lexington, Kentucky, and one from Augusta, Georgia. So, we go to Prezi, which is a bit more useful in this. I have this article, so how do I tell where it came from? Well, first and foremost, I can use my common sense, and I can use my meme database, all my transcriptions, to find other British newspapers that have that. And I found 3. You have the Morning Post from October 3rd, and it's got the same Knoxville-Lexington article. You have the London Packet and Lloyd's Coffee House, and that has a similar article, but it's got this bit about Philadelphia at the top. But then you can see Knoxville and Lexington coming down. And then you have the London World from October 5th, and it's got the same Knoxville, Lexington, and Augusta article. And what I basically decided is that this was the earliest version that had the exact same number of bits. It was the first consolidation of those together. So that's probably where the Glasgow Advertiser got it from. I also happen to know from my wider historical knowledge that Menins had a subscription to the Post. He copied from the Post all the time, so it made sense. So where did the Post get it from? Well, various consolidations. The Knoxville article, these were actually the only 2 copies of the Knoxville article I could find in the various American databases. Everyone else in America, and like everyone else, read this article, but they summarized it, they paraphrased it, they changed it. These were the only word-for-word versions I could find that were exactly the same. One was from the New Jersey Gazette, and one was from the Delaware Gazette. They're not terribly creative when they're naming these newspapers. So I figure out, where am I going to get this? Where did it come from? Well, from this, and from lots of paraphrasing, I figured out it came from the Knoxville Gazette, the 18th of May, 1793, which I'm really sad to say does not exist. And it doesn't exist digitally, it doesn't exist on paper, it's gone. It's lost for all eternity. It's very sad. But there's enough corroboration that I can tell this is where it came from. But what you'll notice is it says May 18th, 1793. And New Jersey says May 18th, but Delaware says May 11th. So they've done a typo. And if you look here, May 11th, not May 18th. And that must almost certainly be where they got it from, is the Delaware Gazette, because of this typo. Lexington, this gets consolidated by the Pennsylvania Carlisle Gazette. You get the 2 little bits, and those 2 little bits came from the Kentucky Gazette itself on 2 different days. And the last one, interestingly enough, the Augusta one, nobody had a word-for-word transcription in the United States for this. Everyone paraphrased it. So the earliest, or the latest I could find was the actual Augusta Chronicle. So somebody in London had a subscription to the Augusta Chronicle, Georgia being very important. So this is my map of how that little article came to be. And what I think is really interesting is the fact that there must be a missing node. There must be something I can't find. Because all three of the London articles have that same bit of Knoxville through Augusta, but the one that comes later has an addendum on top, has additional material. And they all, interestingly enough, misspell the name of the colonel that gets killed. But none of the American ones do. So someone is consolidating this. And I think it's probably Lloyd's Coffee House. There's a journalist there putting it together, selling it to newspapers. But I do have an idea of how I put together this network. And this is more of a drawing than a social network, but I didn't want to cloud it with all the nodes that I didn't discuss. So this is a basic idea, and as you can see, the American news is filtering towards London and then going off in different directions throughout. Now the important thing to remember here, and I'll try to speak quickly, is that in order to put this together, it took me about 3 hours for one article, and I had to use the Google News Archive, the British Library 19th Century Newspapers, newspaperarchive.com, Redex Early American Newspapers, newspapers.com, the University of Kentucky, and various other catalogs. This was not something that was in one database that I could just pull out. So, how on earth do I computer model this? Well, I thought for a long time that I could create a binary flowchart model. I have 2 articles that I know are memes from my various Ngram work. Can I just do yes or no's? Does it have roughly the same amount of words within a certain tolerance? Yes. Is it physically possible for it to have got from London to Edinburgh in 2 days? Yes. Moving along in that direction. You have to have arbitrary tolerance levels because it's not going to work perfectly. Sometimes you have to have references to additional tables. How long does it take to get from London to Edinburgh by postal route? Figure out some way to bypass missing nodes. Generally speaking, a level of flexibility. And what I discovered when trying to create this is it's really difficult to recreate human instinct. I was making assumptions, and not all of them were explainable in a binary system. And I thought, is that a bad thing? Am I actually being a really sloppy historian? Am I just drawing connections with instinct and not doing it in as methodical and rigorous a way as I should be doing it? If I can't explain it to a computer, maybe I'm not doing it in a very scientific way. Haven't come to a full conclusion on that, but it's a thought I've been having. So I was speaking to my friends in the life sciences, and they said, oh, that's a phylogenetic model. Very simple, straightforward, something already exists. And basically, they came to the same conclusion I did. I was complaining that sociologists tell me I don't have enough data. My data is too incomplete to do social network diagramming properly. They weren't the nicest friends on this. But I said, who else is missing data? Evolutionary biologists are missing data. They don't have the DNA of everyone that they are going to map out a family tree, just like I don't have every article. But what works for Gattaca can work for newspaper print as well. And what you can do, generally speaking, is after you've cleaned up the OCR, after you've put them into meme groups, things that are similar, you can start giving them relatedness scores. How much of the text is the same? If text is added, how much is added? Is it added at the top or is it added at the bottom? How far apart are they chronologically? How far apart are they geographically? You can have a modifier for if you know that somebody had a subscription or if you knew somebody always copied from someone else. And once you have all of these different things you can test, biologists have taught me how to model it. You try them in different proportions. Which one's the most important? And eventually, you take your ones you've done manually, you run them through the computer program, and if it still comes up with a yes, you know your model is working, or most likely working. There are problems with this. There are always going to be manual corrections. If there's a direct attribution, without coding every single article, how do I explain that to the computer? Sometimes it's hard to explain. If I put each of those Knoxville, Augusta, and Lexington articles as their own article in my database, they'll never make the connection I did that they were compilations. So how do I explain that without having to go through every single article manually? How do I make the discovery of those initial well-worn paths? And how do I include offline material? And if you go to my blog, mhfields.com, I've started to include all my own offline material, every transcription I've made of hard copy newspapers. I put them up there so other people can use them as well. So the idea in the future is to sweet talk various newspaper repositories into letting me look at their OCR, work on these computer modeling programs with very, very tidy OCR or manual transcriptions, and hopefully run them together to get a relatedness database. And in the end, hopefully, you will be able to look at an article and see where it fits in the grand scheme of reprinting, and whether or not your bold statement you're going to make about how Glasgow feels about immigration holds any water. Thank you very much.